Happy to see new colleagues and familiar faces. Very happy to see you all. So today's seminar is on the history of transnational lives at the ILO, a biographical approach to networks and policies. And just be aware that we are recording the seminar, so if you don't want to appear on screen, please turn off your camera. So my name is Francesca Piana. I'm a visiting lecturer at the Global Studies Institute of the University of Geneva. And as many of you in the audience, I'm also a member of the ILO working group of SISLav, which is the Italian Society of Labor History, a pretty lively gathering of historians with shared interest in social inequalities, worker rights, legal conditions of work, studied against the setting of social, cultural, political, and institutional transformations. And this society also pays attention to questions of methodology, as well as to interdisciplinary and diachronic approaches. So this is the last seminar of a series of 3 exciting meetings which have been taking place since the fall of 2021. In the first one, we reflected on questions of gender relations and politics at the ILO. The second one looked at new analytical venues spurring from a quantitative approach to international organizations and networks. And this last one investigates what the prism of transnational global lives might bring to the study of international organizations. So we thought of this series of seminars as a way to reflect on questions of methodology, historiography, and history writing, as well as a way to prepare the international conference that will take place in the fall in Rome. And the title is Networks of Work, International Officers and Social Networks in the History of an International Labour Organization. We are very happy to share the news that Isabelle Espine-Moret and Daniel Mao will be 2 of the keynote speakers, and the call for papers will be issued soon, so stay tuned. So in today's seminar, we will adopt the prism of international civil servants working at the ILO in the interwar period as a way to gain a deeper insight on their personal and professional motives, different expertise and agendas, pre-existing networks and affiliations before joining the ILO and during the period in which they worked for the ILO. Amalia Ribi Forclaz will question, for instance, what it meant to be an expert, especially in the light of gender dynamics and women's participation in international projects, whereas Tommaso Milani will shed new light on the role of Harold Butler in the period of the Great Depression. Both speakers will highlight the creation and the expansion of epistemic communities and networks within and across the organization by studying the ILO in connection with governments, with the League of Nations, the burgeoning world of non-governmental organizations, trade unions, and workers' association from the Great War to the Great Depression and its long consequences. So now I give the floor to my partner in crime, co-organizer of this seminar, Bruno Settis.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you for having presented our purpose and our series of seminars. I don't have much to add except to present very briefly myself. I am also a member of the ILO working group within the Italian Society for the History of Labor. I am at present a fellow of the Italian Academy at Columbia University in New York. As Francesca Piana has already said, these seminars are not only showcases of new ways of studying international institutions and specifically the ILO, but not only the ILO, as we had seen, for example, in our preceding seminar, which was on quantitative sources and methods for the history of international institutions in a more general sense. But they are also these seminars are also steps towards the final conference, which will be held by the end of the year, and the call for papers will be out soon. As you know, our discussions, our present discussion will be recorded, is being recorded. The videos will finally be uploaded on the SISLav YouTube channel and on its website. And with this very short second introduction, I can't but thank our speakers today, briefly present them. I'm very glad to have here, and I really thank Professor Amalia Ribi Forclaz, Professor of International History and Politics at the Biographical Institute of Geneva, the author in 2015 of Humanitarian Imperialism, and her talk today will be connected, I think, to her ongoing project going by the title The Peasant as a Global Type, International Organizations and the Conceptualization of Rural Development, from 1920 to 1970. Our second speaker is Tommaso Milani, a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute, just came back from a Simon Weil Fellowship at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich, and he will be moving from his earlier researches on Hendrik de Man, the subject of his first monograph, which came out a few years ago, and de Man's networks in European socialism and social democracy, to our subject of today, namely Harold Butler. And we will learn in a few minutes what the history of networks can tell us also about Butler. So first of all, I'll give, thanking you again and thanking you all for your presence. I'll give the floor to Amalia. Thanks.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, Francesca, for this invitation. I'm going to try and share my PowerPoint. Okay. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here and to be talking to an expert group on labor issues. It's a great pleasure. And also I'm looking very much forward to the discussion and to questions you might have. So this paper is based on a book that I'm currently writing up on, which deals with the ILO's conceptualization of agriculture between the 1920s and 70s. And for the purpose of this paper, I want to focus on more deeply on the biography and career trajectory of one of the civil servants of the International Labour Office, Louise Mattei, who was later known as Lady Howard, and who was the chief of the Agriculture Service between 1924 and 1933. Let me very quickly say something about the ILO and agriculture. There has been this idea that was also vehicled by officials of the ILO, especially after the Second World War, that the International Labour Organization did not do much in normative terms for the agricultural sector. I think this idea has to be revisited. And I don't have much time now to go into the details of how the ILO came to actually cover agriculture, but it was a controversial issue. But as you see here in the middle of the slide, the motto clearly puts industry and agriculture on the same level. This is the motto of the International Labour Office that is used in some of the very early correspondence of the organization. And indeed, Albert Thomas and the governing body of the ILO very rapidly decided to put agriculture under the umbrella of social reform. And in 1921, a conference was held, that covered various issues. The idea was basically to apply the same rights to agricultural workers as to people in the industry. And as you can see, it's quite an encompassing range of issues from hours of work, limiting the hours of work in agriculture, something that was dropped for obvious political reasons, to the protection of women and children, to the question of education, the question of housing of waged farm workers, the rights to unionize in agriculture and also to strike, and questions about social insurance, including, for example, unemployment, accident insurance, etc. So quite a bold beginning. In order to prepare the conference, an agriculture service was set up, and it is on this very small unit that I want to focus. And maybe, again, there is this idea that not much happened in normative terms after 1921. It was a big firework early on, and then things were dropped. But if you look at the work of the Agriculture Service, you can actually see a steady kind of production of transnational knowledge on agriculture that is also going to lead to more normative work in the late 1930s. So it takes a bit of time. So the Agriculture Service was set up to collect information on national legislation in agriculture, especially regarding the conditions of waged agricultural workers, so people employed on farms rather than independent farmers, and I'm happy to say more about that in the discussion. It was also set up to run inquiries through surveys and missions, and to answer any queries from governments, journalists, private persons about agriculture labor legislation. Last but not least, it was also meant to liaise with other organizations, such as the International Institute of Agriculture in Rome, for example, and international agriculture trade unions, and generally interest groups that existed at the time. The Agricultural Service was often praised for its esprit scientifique, but it was always understaffed. It actually only had 3 members, of which you can more or less see here. One was the chief of the service, Luise Mattei, on which I will focus in this talk, an Italian agricultural economist, Olindo Gorni, who first was on a temporary contract. He was exiled in Geneva, and is a very interesting character in itself, merits a whole paper. And the Danish economist Fritz von Bülow. All 3 persons in this service were from different generations, different research traditions, different languages, different domains of interest. So it's quite an interesting little group. Both Gorni and von Bülow were in charge of certain areas of research. Gorni on Italy and Latin countries. Von Bülow was focused on Western Europe and Scandinavia. Mattei herself did not have an agricultural background. She had a background in classics. She was a specialist of Greek tragedy, had studied and worked in Cambridge as an academic, but lost her job during the First World War because she was pleading as a pacifist for, I quote, a loving understanding of Germany, and that actually cost her her post. She then worked for Leonard Woolf on his international review. So she was very much involved with internationalist circles and pacifist circles in London around the First World War. And then she entered the ILO through the competitive examination. It is not easy to reconstruct her role in the ILO. And I just want to say something about the archive. I mean, you know, the ILO archive is wonderful. I don't have to tell you that. There is a lot of material that is available digitally, minutes. I mean, it's rare to actually have such an accessible archive. With agriculture, however, there are a few issues. First of all, ironically, because there is this idea that not much happened before the Second World War, quite a lot of materials was destroyed in the 1980s. So it's not easy to reconstruct what was done within the organization on agricultural issues. Also, the gray literature, these reports that are available digitally are sometimes also a bit methodologically problematic because they kind of hide all the tensions that went into doing certain surveys and inquiries. And it seems that in some cases, the material was actually thrown away because there was this final report that could be digitized. So that is also an issue. And then we have the issue that some of the files were lost. For example, the file of Louise Mattei. Here you see the provisionary file under her married name, so very late in her ILO career, around 1932. But we don't have the file of her life before. Her life in the ILO before that. So I had to track down some of her relatives, and luckily her niece, Charlotte Mattei, who lives in England, provided me with some of her aunt's private papers that are uncatalogued and unpublished. Although they don't say anything about the ILO, interestingly. These are novels and plays Louise Mattei wrote in her pastime. So it's not straightforward. These are not very important people. They don't have files of correspondence attributed to them, and their interventions are scattered across various fonts, and you have to look outside of the organization to find out a bit about them. So Mattei, how did she come to head the agriculture service? I think it was a purely kind of bureaucratic career step. She didn't have a particular interest, it seems. She had a very clear interest in internationalism, more generally in social justice as well, but nothing predestined her to work on agriculture. She had, however, a sister who was stationed in India as a royal botanist with her husband, and they both ran an experiment farm. And there is a lot of correspondence with this sister in the 1920s and 30s, and I think this has an influence. They kind of both influence their work through this exchange. As you probably heard in the early presentations on women in the ILO, there are quite a lot of women in the ILO. Almost 50%, I think, of the staff is actually female. There are quite much rarer, obviously, in these kinds of positions as heads of services, etc. A lot of them are clerks, typists, translators. So her situation is rather unique. I mean, there are other people like Sophie Sanger, with whom she actually shared a flat in Geneva. I think what I also need to kind of underline is that she is not in a typically kind of female sphere of intervention. You know, agriculture is really seen as a male sector, and she also has almost exclusively male correspondents, agriculture trade unionists, government representatives, etc. So there is not this kind of movement of women activism that we find in other places. So Mattei really has not a very easy position in this agriculture service. She has very little resources, but at the same time, an extremely big field of action and research. And this is a time where there is not yet much international data on agriculture. There is not much international legislation on agriculture. So actually to collect this from different governments is already quite a task. And Mattei is continuously frustrated by the fact that she cannot do more and do things more globally. She writes regularly to her superior asking for more money, asking for people who can speak Eastern European languages, who can do specific types of research. But her requests are generally turned down. She therefore also invests a lot of energy in building a network with what we would call stakeholders in agriculture. And she reaches out to the rather scarce agriculture trade unions. International agriculture trade unions have just come into being around 1920s. So this is really a sector that is behind the industry when it comes to labor movements, to organized international labor movements. And she tries to build a network, and she spoke various languages, so she could fluently correspond in English, Italian, German, French, etc. She also tries to build cooperation with other institutions, the International Institute of Agriculture in Rome, the League of Nations Health Section, etc., the Rockefeller Foundation. So the Agriculture Service in itself and Mattei do not have much leeway in how they can choose what things to work on and what items would merit research. Obviously, this is something that is decided by the governing body and also by the expert commission that exists on agriculture. In 1920s, a range of inquiries are launched, often multi-country studies. One, for example, on which you see here below, on agricultural education. This is a big undertaking for the Agriculture Service. It has to set up, put together a questionnaire, send it to various governments, collect data on what type of schools exist in rural areas, how are people trained in agriculture, are there specialized schools, etc., etc. This is often done also in order to kind of feel a bit how much governments are prepared to actually work towards international legislation in that domain. There are actually direct questions in the questionnaire. You know, would you be favorable towards a recommendation on agricultural education, etc., or a convention? So this is work that the Agriculture Service does. There's also an inquiry on housing, on which I have written elsewhere, which is also very interesting, comparing the situation of waged people who are often housed on farms in very poor conditions, etc., in different countries, and trying to come up with, which was used, this inquiry, by the governing body to propose, and by the International Labour Conference to come up with a recommendation about housing, the minimal conditions for suitable housing for people who are dependent on farmers, etc., working for farmers in agriculture. So these in itself are interesting materials, and as I said before, one has to look behind this. These are actually accessible and published, but often the primary records behind that prepare the preparation of these surveys are more interesting than the actual result, of course. One example is the survey on rural exodus, which was also launched as a multi-country study on rural exodus. It was supposed to cover Germany, France, Czechoslovakia, and other countries. It was very much planned with the idea that rural exodus was a big problem, people leaving the countryside to go into urban areas. But by the time the study is carried out, interestingly, we are in the Great Depression, and actually what comes out of the study is a reverse trend of people moving out of urban areas back into the countryside because they have lost their jobs in urban areas, etc. So it's also a learning process for the organization itself. But what I asked myself, what kind of latitude did Mattei have when she wanted to bring in her own interests? And there's a good example with a study, and maybe that's also gonna link up then to Tommaso's talk. In 1930, Mattei becomes really concerned about the effects that the depression could have on people working in agriculture. And she writes to her superiors saying, we need to come up with a questionnaire about the effects of the crisis, especially, for example, on wages, but also on housing and on services in rural areas, etc. And she puts together the questionnaire and is very motivated to launch the inquiry, but is cut short by Alberto Va at the time. I mean, this is just before his death, who basically says, no, I mean, there hasn't been any international definition of the crisis in agriculture, so we cannot do this, and she's very frustrated. She still writes her report, which is published in the International Labor Review, which you can see here. So it's interesting to see, and I'll come back to that point, how she navigated the fact that she was always basically put back in her place whenever she wanted actually to do something out of in an autonomous way. In 1943, Mattei leaves the ILO. Things have become really difficult. Her relationship with Alberto Ma was never very good. He was extremely patronizing towards her. And I think by around 1932, there are personal events that come together with institutional problems that basically make her decide to leave the organization. Her sister gets very ill with cancer and dies, and she takes time off to care for her at the very end of her life, and then decides to leave, freeing herself in a way of the bureaucracy of the ILO. Interestingly, the first thing she does is she writes a book titled Labor in Agriculture, an International Survey, which is published under her married name. She also marries around the same time, and which basically is an overview of all the materials that she has been collecting through the Agriculture Service on agriculture, and it's published by the International Institute, the Institute of International Affairs in London. So it gives you the feeling that this is almost, to overcome her frustration, that she would have liked to write this book actually while officially in the ILO, but she does so in 1945. She also goes on to have another career as an environmentalist, we would say today. I mean, very early in the environmental movement. She specializes on soil and becomes also president of the British Soil Association. And she has a very interesting life also in other respects after the ILO. And it's interesting to see that you don't find any trace, and apparently she didn't talk also in her family about her time in Geneva, apart from the weather. And the bees, which she found kind of very cold. But I had to really tell her family what she had been doing in this period in the 1920s and 30s. So let me just conclude very briefly. What do we do with all this information? Sorry. I think Mattei's career in the ILO, to me, reveals various things. On the one hand, obviously that's how I use it in my book. It brings a new perspective on how in the interwar years, agriculture, rural welfare, and social rights of workers in agriculture become a growing field of social and economic policy activity, and a kind of target of modernization, but also this scientization of the social, which historians have written about. It also sheds light, I think, if we take Mattei's career, on the bureaucratic practices and the experiences of civil servants, and especially in this case, women within international institutions. And here I join the work of Susan Peterson, Glenda Sluga, and also anthropologists such as Jane Cohen, who have produced inspiring work on biographies and everyday working practices of legal officials. And I think these studies draw attention to the investment of these civil servants in pursuing the work of the international organizations and kind of trying to redefine some of the work, but also the studies of these historians raise questions about how much personal latitude these people actually had to develop their own approaches. And Mattei's case very much shows us that she has visions, she has aspirations, but basically they're very much limited also by bureaucratic formalism and the need to follow procedures. Often that was actually put forward as a thing that, you know, she couldn't do certain things because the procedure needed to be followed very painstakingly. So this led to disappointment and ultimately also to her decision to leave, I think, although we don't, I mean, she hints at the fact that she couldn't really do much in some of her later work, but she just, I haven't found a letter that says that she was extremely frustrated with the ILO. Mattei's case also shows us that we need to take into account, I would say, the limits that, and I apologize for using such a strong term, but patriarchal hierarchies are posing to her work. And I think I was very surprised to find very little evidence first as to any interest she had in gender issues in agriculture. It seemed to me strange that she would not push, also because clearly some of the gender aspects had been opened up for discussion by the conference. But then when reading her novels, I found very strong statements about, you know, women needing to be interested in political economy and studying mathematics and economy and getting degrees, etc. And it made me think again, and I think it was a strategic decision given the scarcity of her own resources in the ILO, not to actually talk about gender issues. And also, I think probably a strategic decision in order to be taken seriously, which is something that has been described by historians like Aileen Boris for other women. And the last point I want to make is about the position of people like Mattei, who were not part of the clerical staff of the ILO, they're not typists or translators, etc., but also they're not regarded as experts. So they're in this weird in-between category of the civil servant, in a hybrid position, I think. And when we look at her writings, and especially the learning curve which she is on, because in the end she writes these various pieces on housing, on education, on the agriculture crisis, as you have seen. So she really gets some expertise and also authority on certain issues. So that makes her more than just an administrator, I think. And I think we need to redefine a little bit, or maybe discuss these categories also with regard to this in-between hybrid people who were administrators and bureaucrats on the one hand, but they were also trusted correspondents, authors, and researchers on the other hand. So maybe by doing so, we can also gain a new appreciation of the institutional dynamics within the ILO. And with this, I stop here, and I thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amalia. It was actually very interesting. So I suggest that for the time being, we take kind of precise questions, if there's any question of detail, and then we open the collective discussion at the end. So I have a question. Can I start? You know, I mean, I find very fascinating to think that such a small group of people, you know, we're talking about 3 people, they were doing such a massive work. And this is something also I came across with, you know, the refugee section at the ILO or at the League of Nations. So if we think of the huge bureaucracies we have today, you know, it's unbelievable, you know, to compare the quality and the quantity of work. So I was curious about how the mundane work was done, on a daily basis. So how did they collect information? So did they travel to the countries, or did they write to, I guess, kind of national ministries to, collect information? Or if you could give us a sense of how this gathering of information was done.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not muted. Okay. Thank you, Francesca. Yeah, that's a very good question. It's both. I think it's collecting. It's maybe three things: reading, reading journals, reading the press, reading, for example, some of what is produced by other institutions, such as the International Institute of Agriculture, to actually extract information that is seen as relevant, that really is about work. So there is already this process of kind of narrowing down the field, because agriculture is a huge field. It's about writing to ministries and, first of all, trying to find out who is in charge in the various countries and who could actually provide information on certain aspects. And then there are also surveys that are done in the countries themselves. But there is little money for that. So both Gorni and also von Bülow travel. Von Bülow travels to Latvia to write a survey on agrarian reform there. So he interviews people, he travels through the country. The same for the rural exodus survey. He actually travels to Germany and Czechoslovakia for 1 month. In Germany, for example, visiting experiment stations, visiting ministries, talking to a lot of bureaucrats as well. So that's how this information is collected. Yeah.
Tommaso, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for your paper that I greatly enjoyed. Mine is really a curiosity, which is somehow related to my own research on the Depression. In the kind of work you have examined, and especially in what was written after leaving the ILO, have you found any detailed discussion of the destruction of agricultural products and like coffee stocks, for example, in the early mid-1930s? The reason why I'm asking is because when I was studying, more in a way more kind of ideological or political literature about the Depression, like socialist or communist pamphlets in the mid-1930s. The destruction of, for example, a coffee stock in Brazil, but also similar practices followed in several Western countries, were often cited as an example of the irrationality of capitalism and free market practices in the context of the 1930s. And there are also wonderful images in, for example, Joris Evans' movie Boinage about this kind of ways of trying to keep prices high. So my question basically is this part of this ongoing reflection? And, is there any evidence that the figure you've looked at tried to elaborate on this kind of restrictionist practices in the 30s? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So it's a very good question. And there's not much interest in these aspects, I would say, also because the League of Nations is doing also some work on agriculture, especially on the economic side. And there is a very clear idea that, things need to be kept apart, and that the ILO is very much entitled to cover labor questions and less questions about crops or about efficiency of production, although it does do some work about scientific management of farms, etc. So it's a kind of blurry, there are blurry boundaries, but I haven't found, this specifically, I haven't found these kinds of discussions. And I haven't looked for them, I have to say, so maybe they're there. I would have to look more. What happens with the ILO is that it's on the agriculture service, is that in the 30s, what you see very much is basically that the early questions are taken up again, but rediscussed in the light of the Great Depression. So for example, the question of limiting hours of work in agriculture, which is a big question. I mean, even today, you know, how can you limit in the industry, we have the 8-hour day. So how can you limit working hours that go from 14 to 15 hours, but that maybe are seasonally dependent on the weather, etc. So these questions come up again because they're seen as a way to counter unemployment, for example. And, you know, they're seen as a way that they could help manage the crisis. So it's more of the classic labor right issues that come up again. You know, should women work at night on the farms? Should children work? Child work comes back as an issue also in the Depression, because obviously a lot of farms, rather than hiring people, start using family labor. So that creates also problems of unwaged, unprotected children and women. So it's more of these questions that I've seen coming up.
Thank you. Nicola, do you have a question? Please.
Yeah, I have two short questions. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's really interesting. The two questions are connected to the question of Francesca and Tommaso. The first one is, did you see if the people of the section make a difference between governmental sources and sources that can be produced, for example, by professional organization or a private institution? And the other one, in the section, is there a debate about the specificity, because you talk about the specificity of agricultural labor? Is there a debate on the specificity of this type of labor by the member of the section? Because I mean, Olindo Gorni was quite next to agricultural question in Italy, working with Federazione dei Consorzi Agrari. So he had, I think, a quite precise idea on how agricultural labor works. And so this was the question. Thank you.
Thank you. These are two great questions. Yeah, so on the information, they're used, both channels are used, government sources, but also trade unions who can provide. But in a way, it remains rather limited. It's really the people the ILO is in connection with. Also because of the conference, there is this tripartite system. So, you know, they have to find employers and employee organizations that could actually represent the interests of agricultural workers. So it's always a bit of the same people who are used again and again. There is this repertoire almost, but it's not just government sources. But there is a fundamental difficulty of actually finding the information together also with a very kind of Eurocentric lens through which they view agriculture. The second question is extremely interesting. And unfortunately, I haven't found any traces of that point to what's happening between the members of the section, you know, any discussions they might be having. It seems that they're more carrying out things that is asked for them. And obviously the ILO has a very, very, in a sense, clear, maybe limited lens on waged agricultural labor, that it's, you know, it's the thing that comes more closely to people in the industry. They don't know how to deal with small farmers, independent farmers, although they are interested in trying to make the difference. But I mean, in the writings then, for example, of Mattei, you will see that she's very much aware that this is only one category of people. What they say, what she says and what the ILO says is that it's the poorest people. The people who don't have land, the people who have to work, the people who sometimes have to change from one farm to another, who, you know, don't even have a bed, etc. So that's how they legitimize the focus of their work. but clearly there is an opening up in the 1930s, also with regard to colonies and to people that we would say are peasants, small farmers, smallholders, that are not necessarily under contract in another farm. So there is a learning process there as well. But it's, I mean, this in itself could fill an hour talk, basically, the whole conceptualization of who are they talking about, you know, who is the person working in agriculture for them, etc.
Thank you. So I suggested I take the last question and then we move on to Tommaso. So Dorothea, do you have a question?
So first of all, hello to everybody. It's the first time that I joined this group, and it was really, I think I got this call for papers or something, the draft you are working on, and the idea of the conference in Rome in October via Sandrine Cott, with who I work a lot. And when I saw this, and then that you have a study group, and then I contacted Francesca, because I think it, for me, it's very interesting to listen to your research, and especially today, I must say it's very enriching, because agricultural research is a field where we don't have many people, except Amalia, who is doing research for quite some time, and we have seen each other a few years ago, no? It's a long time ago. So I'm very happy to listen, and I find it very interesting, especially to meet Louise Mattei, one of the rare women in charge of a service. I have just a question. What were the relations between the ILO and this agricultural service and the Institute in Rome?
Yes, thank you. That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, the relation is not very good. It's a very complex issue. The International Institute of Agriculture has been there since 1905. It's been working, let's say, since 1909, probably really like putting out things. So they're not very happy, first of all, about the ILO all of a sudden claiming that it covers agriculture. Also, the director of the EIA dies, the American delegate who was very much also one of the founder in 1919, David Lubin. So they're a bit lost at that point when the ILO comes up with this new service and, you know, this new mandate for agriculture. So there's a lot of discussion, also a wider discussion, because it's unclear how the International Institute of Agriculture, what is the relationship with the League of Nations. Luciano Tosi has written about this a lot, you know, so institutionally it's a mess. And clearly they have to somehow work together. So they devise a mixed commission of 3 people from the Institute in Rome and 3 people from Geneva, who will meet either in Rome or in Geneva, etc., to talk about what they consider are the joint problems. And a lot of the discussions of the commissions are about, you know, who is covering what, basically, and how do you separate things. And there are certain things where both services, I mean, the institute and the service claim that they have the authority, you know, wages. Clearly, the International Institute of Agriculture says this is a question of production, so that this is us, and the ILO says, well, this is about living standards, so it's us. And both organizations have advantages and disadvantages. The International Institute of Agriculture says we have always been here and we have much more experience. And the ILO says, well, we have a tripartite system. So we actually make sure that it's not just governments and experts, but we also have employers and employees. So we are much more wider. So this is basically an ongoing discussion. And in a way, funnily, what you can see, because I'm working until the 1960s, is that this thing continues with the FAO in a certain sense. I mean, it's the same commission also that continues weirdly, although the International Institute of Agriculture is basically dissolved. But so the relation, this kind of not very productive relationship continues in the 50s and 60s. So it's a long story. But you see a lot of, yeah, I mean, competition for resources, competition about, they do some joint work. The rural exodus study is a joint study. There is, von Bülow is accompanied by an expert from the International Institute of Agriculture. So this is done jointly, but most of the time it's not very constructive, yeah.
This will, just to give you a little anecdote, this will maybe it changes because one of the candidates for the new Director General at the ILO is now the director, you say, of FIO.
Oh.
Who, Gilbert or Bongo, I don't pronounce correctly his family name, but he was with the ILO, now he is with FIO.
Okay.
Come back. This would be interesting. This would be the end of a complicated story if he came back. That brings a lot of experience in agriculture.
Thank you, Dorothea. I will need to check this. I don't know. I don't know this recent event, so I will definitely come back to you about this. Thanks.
Okay. So thanks a lot, Amalia.
Thanks, Amalia, very much. Thanks to all for the questions. So now I think it's time to move on to Tommaso and listen to his presentation. So Tommaso, you have the floor.
Thank you. Just let me share my slides. I hope you can see them. Well, thank you, Francesca and Bruno, for having me. And thanks to the attendees, it's a great pleasure to meet you all, albeit virtually. I'm also delighted to share this online session with such a distinguished colleague as Amalia, whom I want to thank again for a fascinating paper. As my talk suggests, the focus of my presentation today will lie on Harold Beresford Butler, the British civil servant who was Director General of the International Labour Organization, ILO, between 1932 and 1938, a period that largely coincided with the most acute phase of the Great Depression, both socially and politically. In the next 20 to 25 minutes, I'll provide a very quick overview of how the ILO changed, or at least began to change, under Butler's directorship, but also, and hopefully more interestingly, I'll try to elaborate a little bit on the type of leadership that Butler exerted as Director General. Before that, however, I would like to briefly outline the origins of and rationale for this project and the reasons why I found Butler's figure quite gripping as a research topic. The structure of my talk will be as follows. First, I will explain what I'm currently looking at what stage my research is, and how the project might evolve in the future. Secondly, to the benefit of those who may be unfamiliar with the history of the ILO in the 1930s, I will quickly pinpoint a few substantial transformations the organization underwent throughout the decade. Thirdly, I will delve into Butler's mindset, seeking to pin down what we may describe as the foundations of his social philosophy, informing his view of the ILO as an international actor, but also his understanding of the purpose and limits of social reform as an instrument to pursue social justice. Finally, I will underscore how Butler's style of leadership, which I describe here as constrained, resulted from a combination of external and internal factors, namely, on the one hand, the growingly tense and hostile international environment of the 30s, within which Butler was bound to operate. On the other hand, Butler's conscious decision to keep a low profile, work behind the scenes, and follow a self-styled, piecemeal and non-political approach to international governance and economic regulation. By doing so, I hope to show that Butler deserves even greater scholarly attention than he has received so far, not so much for his relevance as a historical figure, which remains debatable, as for the insights we can gain by studying his thinking, record, and trajectory in the wider setting of the Great Depression and its shifting political landscape. My interest in Butler and the ILO during the interwar period dates back to my PhD, which, as Bruno mentioned, tackled Hendrik de Man and interwar planism as a transnational political endeavor aimed at addressing the most pressing socioeconomic problems caused by the Great Depression. Indeed, I visited the ILO archives for the first time back in mid-2016 to access the correspondence between Albert Thomas and de Man and gather more evidence about their relationship, which somehow paved the way for de Man's unsuccessful bid to succeed Thomas after the latter's untimely death. What struck me then was the richness and analytical depth of many discussions within the ILO, as well as the boldness of the organization's initiatives, beginning at least with the 1931 report on unemployment and public works that stood in stark contrast with the much less imaginative attitude displayed by other bodies and societal actors at that time, including many socialist, social democratic parties, which in the early 1930s often harbored strong reservations about ideas and policy proposals that in hindsight we may call Keynesian or proto-Keynesian. My early archival research, further corroborated by my examination of the then existing literature, prompted me to envisage a research project that would underscore the role of the ILO as a laboratory, if you like, perhaps even as a seedbed for a new model of social and economic governance, wherein social and economic issues could be dealt with through a comprehensive approach, and wherein economic planning was meant to be used systematically to cope with imbalances, bottlenecks, and distortions, preventing a more efficient and fair allocation of resources within industrialized economies. Having a background in political and intellectual history, I soon realized that this project, which I slowly yet consistently pursued since 2017, alongside other commitments and minor projects, would pose a number of challenges to me, some of which are certainly familiar to those of you who have already carried out substantial fieldwork in the history of international organizations. Here I will stress just a couple of them. First, the rather disappointing state of Butler's papers. Whose official files in Geneva are in good shape, accessible, and generally helpful, but whose private papers were destroyed following his death in 1951. Gaps in the existing documentation raise questions about the actual possibility of tracing Butler's evolving views, priorities, and general attitude towards his own duties as Director General, leaving room for multiple interpretations, but also forcing me to be very careful not to read too much between the lines, so to speak, and impose my own categories upon Butler's actions during the Great Depression, which may be less the outcome of a coherent strategy, after all, than a byproduct of contingency and crisis management. Secondly, studying Butler as Director General forced me to engage with the peculiar inner structure of the ILO, wherein leadership is exerted not only towards other international actors, but also and often more subtly, towards its own branches, including its governing body, individual member states, and bureaucracy, that is the web of experts, advisors, and consultants upon which the ILO ultimately relied in performing its task, here the role of transnational networks. I'm pleased to say that the striking gap in the literature about Butler and the ILO in the 30s that I noticed back in 2016 has been largely filled by now, thanks to the recent excellent publications by Guy Fitti-Sinclair, Daniel Maul, and Véronique Platas-Tanger. And yet, as I'll try to explain, more work can and perhaps should be done on the peculiar economic culture that Butler expressed and went on to feed during his term. This is what I'm currently working on. It is well known that under Butler's directorship, the ILO's inner composition and balance experienced a geographical shift, marked first and foremost by the entrance of the United States in 1934, which also led to a growing influence of New Deal expertise over the organization's approach to regulation, an admission that was greatly facilitated by pre-existing transatlantic business networks, as well as by Butler's own trips to the US and ties with the Rockefeller Foundation since the 1920s, even though, as other scholars have pointed out, that the relationship was also occasionally strained. While Butler, in his own reports, for obvious diplomatic reasons, did not explicitly endorse Roosevelt's reforms, a close reading of them, as well as of his correspondence and occasional public statements between 1933 and 1937, leave no doubt that Butler was deeply sympathetic with FDR's quest for, and I quote, a halfway house between complete freedom and complete regimentation, between a state-planned and directed economy on the Russian model and the old system of unregulated competition. What is sought is some means of reconciling the merits of private enterprise with the need for some measure of discipline and organization, end of quote. This is from the 1935 Director General report. Consistently with this insight, the years of Butler directorship were also characterized by a widening and broadening of the ILO's agenda, whose economic interventionism was epitomized by the support provided to conventions on unemployment provisions, the 40-hour week, the reduction of hours of work in highly mechanized sectors, holidays with pay, as well as by recommendations on public works. All these pointed to a social model wherein high levels of consumption made possible by high wages were viewed as buttressing social and political stability, sometimes to the dismay of employers. As Butler himself pointed out, critically reflecting on his own experience in 1944, as well as on the 1919 approach to peacemaking, and I quote, in order to give social progress a favorable prospect, the prevention of war is not sufficient. Economic upheaval is hardly less fatal to social progress than political upheaval. Without a stable economic foundation, it is built on sand, end of quote. Furthermore, Butler's years deserve to be remembered for the early steps taken by the ILO in the field of enhanced regional cooperation and development, creating fora wherein non-Western countries having relatively similar socioeconomic structures could engage in a closer dialogue, as American nations did in Santiago, January 1936, and later on in La Habana, November 1939, as well as launching technical missions with the purpose of assisting countries within and outside Europe that were devising their own paths towards modernization and industrializations. Lastly, the pioneering efforts made in the field of migration must be cited here. through a convention and through recommendations adopted in 1939, but whose origins can be traced back to both Thomas and Butler's directorships, the ILO laid out some basic rules that, if applied, would have allowed greater transparency and a closer intergovernmental monitoring of migration flows, ideally preventing exploitative as well as beggar thy neighbor policies and practices in this highly sensitive area. Considering this degree of dynamism and apparent willingness to enter uncharted waters, one would expect Butler to be remembered as a forebear of the subsequent ILO's turn to global development. And yet, until the very recent contributions I already mentioned, arguably with the major exception of Franco De Felice's 1988 book on Sapere Politica, most accounts have tended to present him as a rather colorless, almost pedantic follower of Thomas' teachings, whose relatively short tenure was overshadowed by the crisis within the international system, as well as by bureaucratic infighting within the ILO. What I'm currently trying to achieve is a more nuanced picture of Butler's social philosophy, also looking at an often neglected primary source, namely Butler's memoir Confident Morning, published in 1950. Regrettably, Butler passed away before writing the second volume, which was supposed to cover the 1920s and 1930s. That book, alongside other books he penned after having left Geneva, shed much light on the defining elements of this author's worldview. There are a few key notions that must be highlighted here, and I would be delighted to expand on these during the Q&A if anyone is interested in hearing more about them. I'll try to be very short and specific. To begin with, Butler understood the role of Director General as that of a diplomatic facilitator, quiet deal maker, and skillful negotiator, rather than as of a standard bearer for any overtly political program or ideology. Not even, I must say, the curious blend of socialist reformism and technocratic managerialism championed by his predecessor, Thomas. Rather, Butler viewed himself as a practitioner in line with the non-political, non-partisan tradition of the British civil service, whose main duty was to carefully manage and fine-tune institutions to underlying social transformations rather than triggering the latter from without. Consistently with this preference for organicist evolutionistic change, Butler repeatedly stressed his antipathy toward sweeping policy prescriptions based on abstract doctrines. As he put it in 1924, and I quote, "There is no such thing as an international solution which you can evolve theoretically and apply universally. Anything that is done internationally has got to be built up on the experience, the experiments of different countries, taking what is best out of each of them and generalizing that into a principle which can be applied all over." End of quote. Another important component of Butler's mindset was his emotional attachment, not only to the British Empire, later to the Commonwealth, but to the Victorian era, which he identified as the high watermark of global interdependence, as well as a period of widespread confidence in human progress, technological development, and personal freedom, fueling an optimistic state of mind that, in his view, the League had to revive as far as possible in order to gain legitimacy before international public opinion. Finally, Butler's fascination with planning owed much to his admiration for Herbert Asquith and David Lloyd George, and to the new liberalism that emerged in Britain in the early 900s. Still, his relatively benevolent take on social legislation as a method to curb the evils of industrial development was also matched, as often happened to British liberals of Butler's generation, by an outspoken fear of direct state control, nationalization of enterprises, and government profligacy. Butler's endorsement of planning was always a qualified and limited one, assuming the state would be able to manage economic fluctuations largely via monetary means, here the influence of his friend Keynes is clear, without encroaching upon the private sphere, and retracting into more limited functions whenever the economic cycle allowed it to do so. In conclusion, I would like to return to the issue of leadership that I touched upon at the beginning of my talk. There's no question that Butler filled Tommaso's shoes in 1932 under extremely difficult circumstances that were set to leave a defining mark on his tenure. To quote Robert Boyce's fitting expression, the great interwar crisis turned out to be the outcome of two mutually reinforcing processes: an economic crisis that bred political instability and radicalization, and a political crisis making sensible multilateral economic solutions unviable, even among those countries whose elites were, after all, deeply reluctant to challenge the 19th century common wisdom about the alleged benefits of monetary stability and fiscal restraint. Within that kind of international environment, marked by the rise of national antagonisms and imperial rivalries, and further exacerbated by Germany's withdrawal from the League in November 1933, Butler certainly faced overwhelming external constraints that would have forced any Director General to take the prospect of a collapse of the League machinery very seriously, as he did. Yet it must be acknowledged, as I try to do in this presentation, that Butler's constraints were also, to a certain extent, self-imposed. Although in practice, he quietly steered the ILO towards substantial changes in membership, new fields of inquiry and activity, and a significantly broader mission that went well beyond social policy narrowly defined, he carefully refrained from articulating a fresh, energizing vision for the organization publicly, at least until he remained in office, and rather emphasized continuity with the original 1919 labor provisions of the Versailles Treaty, even when some of his bolder initiatives suggested his approach was actually much more flexible and creative. Why is that? Well, I believe the factors I mentioned, Butler's self-perception as an enlightened technocrat and consensus builder with a non-political agenda, his empirically oriented view of policymaking, his affection for the Victorian period, and this ideological embrace of a brand of social liberalism that nevertheless made him wary of statism and bureaucratization at the national level, set limits to his ability to lay out a clear, positive agenda for the ILO that the public could easily recognize and engage with. All this may lead us to a further reflection on the nature and limits of innovation within a prominent international organization such as the ILO during a major crisis. Crises offer, we all know, windows of opportunities for new ideas and new practices to emerge. And yet Butler's tenure suggests that the imperative to prioritize survival can easily discourage international civil servants from crafting an adequate conceptual framework to present and sell bold experiments to the general public. Within that context, even the most groundbreaking policy proposals are likely to be couched in a terminology that is both reassuring and uninspiring, for agreement among member states can be reached more easily if solutions are presented on familiar terms and as cautious steps forward rather than sharp departures from the status quo. In retrospect, Butler's constrained leadership can be praised for consolidating the ILO's precarious standing through some concrete, effective actions whose long-term consequences were largely beneficial to the organization. Still, what Butler did not manage to accomplish, and here is my final point, was an original intellectual synthesis transcending Wilson's and Thomas' heritage, by which the ILO's new priorities could be crystallized and reconciled with its traditional internationalist language and orthodox tasks. That too, for better or worse, became part of Butler's legacy. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tommaso. It was very interesting. So I open the floor for content-related questions. So I had one. So Bruno, do you have a question?
Yes, I'll take advantage of my position for a couple of questions. One for Tommaso and another one also for Amalia, which had been thank you both for your talks. I really enjoy them. They, by dealing with mainly with two different decades, they allow us to see a part of the parable of the ILO in the interwar years, and I think that it has been quite interesting also from the methodological point of view, the kind of what can we do by studying specific figures and their thinking, their view of social reform, etc. I have a couple of questions on this. As for Tommaso, it is certainly true that Harold Butler identified himself within this tradition of impartial civil service and at the same time social liberalism, but not knowing much about British history, I would think very simply that that very tradition is not completely is not only one. It is also made of different traditions within itself. Okay, both it would be enough to think probably of the difference between the vision more inclined towards social reform and the so-called treasury view, both within, I mean, the tradition of civil service. Okay, so talking of traditional civil service may mean different things. Can we say that the case of Butler, he is more on the side of a more keen on spending social reform rather than the treasury view, just to take through the two most obvious extremes? But my point is the traditional civil service is articulate, is not single in the British case, and therefore is less impartial that each of its parts thinks of itself, probably. I'll go back to a couple of questions for Amalia. The first one, among the different topics in the history of, in the interests of Louise Mattei that you have dealt with, you did not mention the only one that I admit I actually knew, mechanization. You briefly mentioned scientific management at the moment, but more broadly, I think she wrote an article more or less in the same period on mechanization. in agriculture, obviously, and I wonder whether it was only an episode or it was part of a broader interest, which was probable also since it was connected to modernization development, and at that time it was considered one of the possible causes and or of the possible remedies for depression. A question for both would be the relationship they had with communism. Was it different from Albert Thomas? In the case of Louise Mattei, did she think of the Krestintern, the same bad things that Albert Thomas thought of the Comintern? And in the case of Harold Butler, was he more open to the kind of international anti-fascist alliance that Roosevelt was showing some kind of interest for, and that eventually came up only obviously after Harold Butler directorship of the ILO? Was he a bit more open, not to communists on the national level? I'm not talking of popular fronts or anything of the such, obviously, but rather on the, accepting them as a part of the international international discussions, and specifically of letting the Soviet Union as a member of the ILO, even if it was not a part of the League of Nations. So these are my questions for all of you. Thanks. Thanks again.
Amalia, do you want to go first?
Okay.
As you like.
Myself. These are big questions. Thank you, Bruno. Yeah, I mean, mechanization, she wrote a piece on mechanization. I mean, there are other things she writes about as well, the representation of workers. I think you're right. The mechanization shows this kind of idea, or to use Tommaso's concept of philosophy, which I find interesting, that agriculture has to change in a way, but you have to be careful about the social implications. But mechanization could at least, provide some efficiency and also reduce the number of inefficient people, and so redistribute a bit the population. So it's a very kind of balanced piece, she writes. But this is also an interesting thing. There is no other bigger survey on mechanization, for example, in agriculture done. So I think it was, you must be right, it was one of her own interests, much as the agriculture crisis, although this kind of gained a bit more relevance. Relationship with communism, the agriculture trade unions, there is one that is leftist, but anti-communist. And this is very much the accepted partner for the agriculture service. It's the International Land Worker Federation. You don't feel much about communism after the Bolshevik inquiry, which I didn't say, but also concentrates a lot on agriculture. After that, communism is not really the problem for the ILO. Fascism is, because a lot happens with Italian organizations trying to take over the international field, with international congresses being organized in Italy, but also in Germany, etc. And there is a clear kind of drive to take this away from the liberal social reform umbrella of the ILO. So I think with communism, I don't see much. There are some writings about agriculture in Russia. There's some concern about famine, obviously, which is a big issue, both just after the First World War, but also later in the 1930s. But politically, the concern is with the relationship with what do we do with fascist organization, fascist experts, how do we navigate? And Butler has an interesting role to play in how he navigates these kind of invitations. Conveniently, the people that should go are always either employed elsewhere or they're sick. So, it's one way to kind of sidestep this diplomatic issue of attending congresses that are clearly organized under a fascist umbrella. I think I stop there because otherwise I keep going.
Okay, thank you, Bruno, for your questions. Let's start with the sort of tradition of the British civil service. I entirely agree with you, but I would like to stress, perhaps even more strongly, that I did in my presentation, that this is an entirely self-constructed identity, if you like. This assumption of the neutrality of the civil service very much reflects Butler's own culture, a product of Oxford. He went to Balliol College, then to All Souls. He wanted to be a diplomat in the first place. He had to join the domestic civil service as a consequence of the lack of openings in the Foreign Office, and you can say very much this is again an artificial identity that Butler constructed over the years in order to justify his own positions. However, taking your dichotomy into account, I would say there is a tension there. Butler is certainly by the late 1930s persuaded that counter-cyclical spending is a necessity. Again, he's very close to Keynes. He understands early on the importance of the general theory as a set of practical tools in order to curb the most dreadful consequences of economic depressions, always with an eye to political stability. It's very, very clear he's much less concerned with emancipation of the working class than with creating a suitable framework for liberal democracy. But at the same time, he's also very worried, particularly in the second half of the 40s, about what the Labour Party did in power in Britain. Interestingly enough, some of the pages he wrote in 47, 48, and later on 1950 are perhaps closer to Hayek in a way than to Keynes. And I think this says something about the kind of unspoken assumptions about the role of the state that someone like Butler had back in his mind. The reason why he supported the tripartite representation and he supported unionism and industrial representation was in order to foster this kind of constructive climate of dialogue between the two sides. But at the same time, he was very worried that, again, nationalizations, growing state power, and this kind of overlap between trade unions and the state under, for example, a Labour government would actually destroy the kind of balance he promoted within the ILO. He is very, very clear, particularly in Confident Morning, about the link he saw between state socialism on the one hand and the eventual downfall of democracy as an almost inevitable outcome. Here is the kind of reference to Hayek I made. And again, it is quite striking. One is left wondering how much of this was already present in his mind in the early 30s, for example. But there are interesting elements in his reports and some of his letters about this uneasiness about state power that are quite interesting and even striking. On the issue of communism, again, very fascinating question and very fascinating topic. I'll try to be quick. There's a in a way very paternalistic view of the roots of communism and success of communism in Central and Eastern Europe in particular, both discussing the achievements of Soviet reforms and industrialization from above in the 1930s, and in discussing Sovietization of Central and Eastern Europe after the Second World War in Butler's writings. Essentially, his point that he made again and again was that communism is what happens when you fail to ensure certain standards of living within a society, and you fail to take very legitimate basic needs of the working class into account when developing a kind of social policy within an industrial context. Again, there is an element of paternalism here, I would say. The way in which he wrote about what happened in countries like Czechoslovakia or Hungary or Poland reflects also a certain attitude, I would say, towards Central and Eastern Europe, and Russia more broadly, which is frequently referred to as a backward country with no experience of liberal tradition and values. But I would say communism is often presented and described as the kind of danger that might actually appear in the West as well. Every time conservative groups are too strong or too reluctant to make concessions or endorse social reforms that could actually end up strengthening capitalism rather than weakening it. And again, this is very much part of the tradition of social liberalism, which had this kind of very profound and enduring ambiguity towards the rationale for promoting social reform. Again, I could go on for long, so I prefer to stop here, but I hope I gave you a very short kind of overview of his attitudes.
Dorothea, you have the floor.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Tommaso. This was very inspiring, especially now there is, with these elections, there is quite a focus on the director generals again. And I just have started to read a new PhD dissertation on Albert Thomas, which has been done by Adeline Blasevich in Paris with Isabelle Lespinet. So this is also very interesting work. And then now to see Butler, who is quite a contrast to Albert Thomas. There's always this feeling that he was not intellectually a high-flying director general who came up with this new concepts and ideas. Most recently, it was certainly decent work with Somavia in the early 2000s. This was the new concept. But I think it's very interesting to see that there is a crisis, and the first reaction is to try to survive and to save the organization. And then the next step is to reinvent the organization. And this happened then in Philadelphia in 1944. And I would say later, there was a crisis. The next one was the end of the Cold War. And there were two levels of reinvention. First, to define the core conventions and the Declaration of 98. And then in 2000, the decent work concept. And now we have, again, with COVID, an incredible social and economic crisis, health crisis, everything together. And we will see if the next Director General, if he continues a little bit in the survival mode, which I think was the one we had in the past 10 years, or if he will come up with a bold and a new approach to tackle this crisis. These are just these ideas that come out of your excellent talk, and I don't know if this is useful, because you have probably at some point to link it also a little bit to the current situation in your whatever conclusion. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Maybe just a quick comment on this. Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I began looking into Butler indeed is because I've always been quite intrigued by figures who are quite reluctant to go public about their own convictions, like myself, perhaps. And what struck me is that, again, there is, I believe, a set of ideas and perhaps, again, a mindset, a mood, a sensitivity, I don't know how to call it, but which is very much part of the intellectual history of the League and of international organizations in general. I remember when I was reading The Deluge by Adam Tooze, and I was in a way very much influenced by the kind of interpretation of Wilson he provided, pointing to this kind of Burkean attitude towards organicist change and kind of evolutionary relationships within the international environment. And again, this is very much part also, I think, of Butler's worldview, this idea that essentially the key task of international organizations is not to kick off major changes, it's just, to second them and try to understand, where change is happening in society, flow, and, which kind of trends are developing. And the purpose of politics in general, also international politics, is just to turn these developments into more manageable, less destructive phenomena than they were without international organizations, without state organizations, and so on and so forth. So it's in my view, it's a fascinating culture that emerges from these kind of sources. Obviously, the challenge, and I want to stress this element again, is that figures who feel this way are always very reluctant to articulate them, and one really has to search for moments, occasions, also types of publications in which figures like Butler, but also other international civil servants, try to expand a little bit on these unspoken assumptions and make them a little bit easier to understand, more intelligible to the readers. But there is this underlying culture, and I think it's definitely part of the kind of culture that certain international organizations at least develop and keep within their bureaucracies.
Thank you. Is there any other question?
I just wanted to add one question. Do you think it's British? Because I'm just thinking about, I mean, it reminds me a lot of Guy Ryder, who came from Britain, current Director General, and he came after Somavia, who had this decent work concept, which is very well known and accepted by now. And Guy Ryder, he didn't come up with something revolutionary new, but he had this kind of pragmatic approach, see the changes and then react to this. So
yeah, it's certainly, it's not exclusively British, but I believe there's definitely a strand of thought in Britain that is very powerful in that regard. I mean, you can see also what Butler said after the Second World War about European integration. He clearly belongs to the camp of, if you like, functionalist. He joined Van Zeeland organization, the League for Economic Cooperation, and he repeatedly insisted on that there was absolutely no need for a blueprint for integration. All the federalist nonsense, blah blah blah. It was all about bringing experts together and let technical cooperation move on, and step by step, gradually, without trying to accelerate too much or speed things too much, that would actually evolve into some sort of more or less coherent organization in Europe that would, in a way, limit, at least in certain respect, national sovereignty. But again, it was much more, in tune with what, let's say, David Maitrani was writing, rather than any federalist after the Second World War. You can find similar attitudes in among other British thinkers, like Lord Davies in the 30s, for example, and so on.
Thank you.
Amalia?
Yes, thank you. I have a question for Tommaso, obviously not for myself. Yeah, it's, I'm curious about the archives, because I've never actually used Butler's papers or Thomas' papers, although I've obviously read about them and also read the published work about the travel journals of Thomas. But I'm wondering really, how much latitude does the director have? If you look at his correspondence in terms of his network, who is he able to draw in? How is he able to influence the organization's kind of vision? And also because I know from Thomas, for example, Gorny in the agricultural service was clearly a friend or an acquaintance of Thomas, who had private issues. He had to exile himself with his family, and Thomas suggests to him he can work temporarily, and then it becomes this situation where he actually becomes a full member of staff. So I wonder, can Butler do similar things? His old boys network from Oxford, is there anybody landing in Geneva, or is he actually constrained also by the fact that the organization has a certain life behind it already? It's kind of set in its ways. He has to inherit things from Thomas he probably would rather not inherit. So just curious about how much there is in terms of this kind of information, or is there a lot of bureaucracy actually?
Can I just jump on this and ask a question as well, which is directed to both of you? You know, you've been talking a lot about networks, connections, groups, and I wonder, you know, we all know the work of Saint-Rincotte about epistemic communities that has been very important, right? To write, you know, a richer history of international organizations. I was wondering how relevant it still is, because it seems to me that it's part of your story, but there are also other elements that are important: generation, nationality, education, age. So, you know, I was wondering, you know, how you apply these molds, if you apply it at all, and if you still find it useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I can go first to cover both questions, and then I will let Amalia reply with regard to her research. Well, I mean, absolutely. Excellent question about Butler's own contribution in terms of networks and connections. I would say one very important part of the story, of course, is that Butler was, you know, as you know, deputy director. So he could easily, you know, cast himself as, you know, the heir of Thomas, and was able to rely on you know, virtually all the kind of connections and acquaintances Thomas had. He was there for a very long time, since the very beginning, really, in fostering those ties and connections, even when he was not directly involved. So in that sense, there is definitely a lot of continuity. You also brought something specific, perhaps, you know, in several areas. I've looked specifically at his role, again, in strengthening his relationship with the United States. And there is absolutely no doubt, for example, that, you know, also because of his sort of language and sort of greater familiarity with the United States, the fact that Thomas was actually quite keen to let him go during the 20s, he was in a better position to build ties and connections, you know, with the US. And so he was always, in a way, well before becoming Director General, a transatlantic player. But even then, of course, there were certain decisions later on when he was Director General that reflected his growing concerns about, you know, politicization and the danger that developing certain ties could actually damage the ILO rather than strengthening it. And here I can just briefly refer to the fact that he was also the one who called off this attempt to establish a closer relationship with the Rockefeller Foundation in the 30s, because, well, for many reasons, really. He had been, by the way, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation in 1926 when he went to the United States. He had a grant. One of the pictures I put in on my slides was a picture of him and James Davis, the U.S. Secretary of Labor then, under Coolidge. And so he had this kind of connection, but later on he became increasingly worried that some of the research done by the Rockefeller Foundation could actually be incompatible with the non-political stance the ILO was taking towards, for example, kind of totalitarian regimes, and therefore he kind of stopped that partnership from developing even further. So on the one hand, there was continuity, but of course, when it comes to making decision of how to use that expertise in those connections, when he was general director, was also capable of, you know, setting his own priorities and sort of, you know, setting limits to the way these pre-existing networks could be used. The second question, epistemic communities. I believe the notion is important in order to map, to chart, if you like, this kind of more or less informal, you know, networks and connections that are there. To be fair, I believe we also ought to be very careful in sometimes overstating the significance of these ties, or assuming that a connection always results in a more or less direct influence of somebody over somebody else. I understand this is a very common sense remark, but you know, again, having an exchange of letters doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, there was a huge intellectual cross-fertilization going on. And I would say it's important, in my view, to be cautious about how much we can you know, draw from this kind of links. Similarly, if we may find an additional value in research on biographies and looking also at individual biographies, is to try to do justice to this, you know, great plurality of experiences and, again, cultural dimensions that can be found in the people surrounding the ILO. You know, there was no dominant culture. There was never a fully dominant culture in any major international organization. And again, although it is important to bear in mind that certain times, certain approaches or certain ideas like rationalization in 1920s, for example, were certainly more influential than in other times, it's also worth stressing the specificities and role of, you know, very individual takes and experiences, and how individuals in all their richness and complexity could bring new ideas and new models of policy within the ILO as well as other international bodies. And so it's all about balancing this more collective dimension with the specific inputs that came from perhaps even marginal figures who nevertheless are fascinating in their own right.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Yes, thanks, Francesca, for this question about the networks. With Mattei, I think it's a bit different because she clearly has a career break, we would say nowadays. She's uprooted. She leaves Cambridge under a very bad vibe. And she arrives in Geneva very much cut off, basically, from what was the academic crowd she probably interacted with. So it's not like she can use these connections in any way. I think she builds connections during her time at the ILO that she will use later on, that's for sure. But for example, she still uses some of her family connections, her sister's husband, who actually becomes her own husband later on, but that's a long story. Albert Howard, you know, publishes in the International Labor Review on labor experimentations on Indian farms, etc. So there's clearly a way she tries also to mobilize some of the people she knows, but it's not in any way. I think she doesn't have much autonomy in whom she with whom she actually corresponds. It's something that clearly is there are some expectations, you know, and in a way it's dictated, you know, which trade union, etc. are we going to interact with. So she cannot really go out to find people. And then basically exchange on things. What I'm a bit also interested in is the life outside of the ILO in Geneva. I know from other writings, from other people's memoirs, mentioned that she was in the British drama group with people like Grimshaw from the native labor section. So I wonder what things went on there in terms of exchanging about work or not. And she also lives, I said that she lives, she shares a flat with Sophie Sanger and her partner, on a flat above Albert Thomas' flat, which also leads to some tensions because they're having frequent parties and inviting, I think, the crowd from International Geneva. So this is also something that might be interesting to explore, the social life outside of the organization, which I think was a lot connected. I see that from now. I mean, I work in the middle of, you know, this UN zone, and I think people are expatriates, so they connect with people at work, and that's also a question, you know, what's going on outside of your working hours, basically. Whom do you interact with, etc.
Yeah, I think probably we need more novels, right, as well,
Yes.
in addition to La Belle du Seigneur. Yeah.
Voilà, exactement.
Okay. If there's any question, I would say that I would like really to thank both of you, Amalia and Tommaso, for your fascinating talks. I think the discussion was also very interesting, thanks to all of the colleagues who joined today, and thanks to Bruno as well from New York City.
Thank you all.
So it's still morning for you, so you have a full day ahead, I guess.
More or less. Okay, thanks again for participating to everybody. See you soon.
Yeah. Well, I think it was really a great combination of two very complementary papers. So thank you again. Grazie. So this is the end of this first cycle of seminars. And as Bruno said, we will send out the call for papers very soon. So we hope we will see you in Rome in the fall.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Thanks again to all.
Grazie.
Buona serata.
Buona serata.
Grazie, ciao a tutti.
Ciao, grazie mille.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Grazie.
Ciao, bye.